I hid from my son that my monthly salary is $62,000. He invited me to his wife's luxury boutique grand opening. I wanted to see how they would treat a simple person, so I showed up pretending to be poor. As soon as I walked in, I noticed the judgment in their eyes. Minutes later, I heard my DIL say, "Old pauper! She should be ashamed to wear those depressing clothes." At that moment, I simply said one sentence that, "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached." My name is Mary Ann, and at 71 years old, I thought I knew everything there was to know about human nature. I was wrong. The invitation arrived on cream-colored cardstock, embossed with gold lettering that probably cost more than most people spend on groceries in a week. "You are cordially invited to the grand opening of Luxe Boutique," it read in elegant script. Below, in smaller print, "Brixton Whitmore Hayes presents an exclusive collection." My daughter-in-law's name stared back at me from the paper, and I felt that familiar knot form in my stomach. Brixton. The woman who had systematically erased me from my son's life over the past 3 years. The woman who answered Damon's phone when I called, claiming he was too busy to talk. The woman who had turned family dinners into interrogations about my finances, always with that sweet smile that never quite reached her eyes. I set the invitation on my kitchen counter, next to the stack of investment reports that showed my monthly income of $62,000, money that Damon knew nothing about. Money that I had worked decades to accumulate after my husband's death, penny by penny, investment by investment, while living modestly in the same small house where I'd raised my son. The house where Damon used to visit every Sunday, before Brixton. Now those visits had dwindled to obligatory holiday appearances, where Brixton would comment on my charming little home with thinly veiled condescension, and Damon would avoid eye contact, embarrassed by his mother's simple lifestyle. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about the invitation. Why had they invited me? Brixton usually found excuses to exclude me from their social events. "It's more of a professional gathering," she'd say. Or, "We thought you might be more comfortable at home." Then it hit me. They needed warm bodies. A grand opening required guests, and even an embarrassing mother-in-law was better than empty chairs. The idea came to me slowly, like dawn breaking through heavy clouds. What if I went? Not as Mary Ann Hayes, the woman who could afford to buy that entire boutique without blinking, but as the poor widow they believed me to be. What if I tested them? What if I finally saw who they really were when they thought no one important was watching? I spent the next 2 days preparing. I dug through my closet, past the designer pieces I kept for special occasions, past the quality pieces that would last decades. I found what I was looking for in a box in the back, an old cardigan my sister had given me years ago, faded and slightly pilled. A skirt I'd worn to church in the 80s, now outdated but clean. Sensible shoes with scuffed heels. I looked in the mirror and saw exactly what I wanted to see. An elderly woman of modest means, trying her best but clearly outclassed. The boutique was located in the upscale Meridian district, where parking meters cost more per hour than some people made in a day. I circled the block twice before finding a spot 3 blocks away, passing gleaming BMWs and Mercedes that probably cost more than most people's houses. As I walked toward the boutique, I could see through the floor-to-ceiling windows that the event was already in full swing. Women in designer dresses clinked champagne glasses while men in tailored suits examined price tags with casual indifference. The door was heavy glass and chrome, the kind that whispered exclusivity. A young woman in a black dress that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget greeted me with a professional smile that faltered when she took in my appearance. "Good evening," she said, her tone shifting from warm to politely confused. "Are you here for the opening?" "Yes," I replied, keeping my voice soft. "My daughter-in-law invited me." She glanced at her tablet, clearly searching for a name that would match my appearance. "And you are?" "Mary Ann Hayes." Her finger scrolled, and I watched her expression change when she found my name. Relief, mixed with something else. Pity, perhaps. "Of course, please come in. There's champagne and hors d'oeuvres." I stepped inside, and the assault on my senses was immediate. Everything was white and chrome and blindingly bright. The clothes hung like pieces of art, each item isolated and spotlit. Price tags dangled like accusations. $800 for a simple blouse, $1,500 for a handbag that looked like it could hold maybe a wallet and keys. I moved slowly through the space, hyper-aware of how I looked among these people. Women with perfect hair and perfect makeup turned to glance at me, their eyes sliding over my outfit with barely concealed distaste before they resumed their conversations. That's when I saw Damon. My son stood near the back of the store, laughing at something a tall man in an expensive suit had said. He looked handsome in his navy blazer, his dark hair perfectly styled. For a moment, my heart swelled with pride. Then our eyes met. I watched as his expression shifted from surprise to embarrassment. He glanced around quickly, as if checking to see who might have noticed his connection to the elderly woman in the faded cardigan. "Mom," he said as I approached, his voice carefully neutral. "I didn't think you were coming." "The invitation said the whole family was welcome," I replied, studying his face. "I thought that included me." "Of course it does," he said, but his smile was tight. "Let me find Brixton. She'll want to say hello." He didn't offer to get me a drink. He didn't ask how I was. He simply excused himself and disappeared into the crowd, leaving me standing alone among strangers. I moved toward a display of scarves, each one priced at more than I used to spend on Damon's entire school wardrobe. The silk was beautiful, I had to admit. But $800 for a scarf? I thought about the women I knew from church, working 2 jobs to pay rent, stretching every dollar until it screamed. "Excuse me." I turned to find a woman about my age examining a pearl necklace. She was impeccably dressed, but her eyes were kind. "I couldn't help but notice you admiring the scarves," she said with a gentle smile. "They are lovely, aren't they?" "Beautiful," I agreed, though perhaps a bit beyond my budget. She laughed, a genuine sound that stood out in the sea of artificial chatter around us. "Mine too, I'm afraid. I'm Eleanor Hartwell. I'm here with my daughter. She insisted I come, though I feel rather like a fish out of water. Marianne Hayes. I know exactly what you mean." We chatted for a few minutes, and I found myself genuinely enjoying her company. She was sharp and funny, with a self-deprecating humor that reminded me of old friends. Then I heard my name called. "Marianne." I turned to see Brixton approaching, resplendent in a cream-colored dress that probably cost more than some people's cars. Her blonde hair was perfectly coiffed, her makeup flawless. She looked like she'd stepped out of a magazine. "I'm so glad you could make it," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone that suggested the opposite. Her eyes took in my outfit, and I watched her struggle to maintain her smile. "Thank you for inviting me," I replied. "The store is lovely, isn't it?" Brixton's voice grew animated as she launched into what was clearly a rehearsed speech about her vision, her aesthetic, her carefully curated collection. I nodded at appropriate intervals, watching her face, noting how her eyes kept darting to other guests, more important guests. "I hope you'll find something that speaks to you," she concluded, though her tone suggested she doubted any of these pieces would speak to someone like me. That's when it happened. I was examining a simple black dress, wondering who would pay $2,000 for something so basic, when I heard Brixton's voice carry across the store. "I don't know why some people bother coming to events like this when they clearly can't afford anything." I froze, my hand still on the dress. "I mean, look at that old woman over there," Brixton continued, her voice dropping to what she probably thought was a whisper. "Damon's mother. She shows up in that depressing outfit, touching everything with her grubby fingers. It's almost embarrassing." My heart stopped. I glanced around and realized she was talking about me, to a small group of well-dressed women who were nodding in agreement. "Some people have no shame," one of them replied, "coming to a place like this when they clearly don't belong." "Exactly," Brixton said, warming to her theme. "I mean, we invited her out of politeness, but honestly, she should have declined. Old pauper. She should be ashamed to wear those depressing clothes to an event like this." The words hit me like physical blows. Old pauper. Depressing clothes. Should be ashamed. I stood there, surrounded by luxury I could afford 10 times over, listening to my daughter-in-law mock me to strangers. Listening to her call me a pauper while wearing jewelry that I could have bought without a second thought. The irony was so thick I could taste it. I turned slowly, meeting Brixton's eyes across the room. She had been so absorbed in her cruel commentary that she hadn't noticed I'd heard every word. When she saw me looking at her, her face went pale, but she recovered quickly, painting on that familiar fake smile. I walked toward her, my heart pounding but my steps steady. The group of women she'd been talking to scattered like leaves in the wind, suddenly very interested in examining merchandise. "Brixton," I said, my voice calm and clear. "What a lovely event." "Marianne," she stammered, clearly unsure how much I'd heard. "I was just telling everyone how happy we are that you could join us." I smiled then, a real smile, because I had just learned everything I needed to know about my son's wife, and she had no idea what was coming. "That's very kind of you, dear," I said softly. "But you know, there's something I think you should know about appearances." She looked confused, as well she might. "Sometimes," I continued, my voice barely above a whisper, "the people who look like they have the least are the ones who control the most." I watched her brow furrow as she tried to process my words. Then I simply smiled, patted her arm gently, and walked away, leaving her standing there with an expression of growing confusion. As I made my way toward the exit, I caught sight of my reflection in one of the boutique's mirrors. I looked exactly like what I'd intended. An elderly woman of modest means, slightly out of place but dignified. What Brixton didn't know, what none of them knew, was that tomorrow morning I would wake up in my modest little house and check my investment portfolio that could buy this entire building. What they didn't know was that beneath my faded cardigan beat the heart of a woman who had spent decades learning exactly how cruel people could be to those they perceived as beneath them. What they didn't know was that their worst nightmare had just walked out the door wearing sensible shoes and a gentle smile, but they would learn soon enough. I drove home through streets that blurred together in my memory, past landmarks that marked the geography of my son's childhood, the ice cream shop where we'd celebrated his first report card, the park where I'd taught him to ride a bicycle after working a double shift, the library where we'd spent countless Saturday mornings because it was free and warm and filled with stories that could transport us anywhere. All places where Damon used to smile when he saw me coming. My modest house sat at the end of Maple Street, exactly as it had for 32 years. White clapboard siding, blue shutters, a small front porch where I'd rocked Damon as a baby. The neighbors' houses had been upgraded over the years, expanded and renovated, but mine remained unchanged, by choice. Let them think I couldn't afford better. I pulled into my driveway and sat for a moment in the darkness, replaying Brixton's words, "Old pauper." The phrase echoed in my mind, each repetition stoking a fire that had been smoldering for 3 years. Inside, I made myself a cup of tea and settled into my father's old recliner. The house was quiet except for the tick of the mantel clock, a wedding gift from my late husband Robert that had marked the hours of our life together for 41 years. I reached for the photo album on the side table, its leather cover worn smooth by countless viewings. The first picture showed Damon at 3 months old, sleeping in my arms. I remembered that day perfectly. Robert had just left for another business trip, leaving me alone with our colicky baby and a pile of unpaid bills. But I was happy then, exhausted and worried and overwhelmed, but happy. I turned the pages slowly, watching my son grow from a chubby-cheeked toddler to a serious-faced boy, to a young man I barely recognized anymore. There he was at 6, missing his front teeth, grinning as he held up a drawing of our family. At 10, proud in his Little League uniform that I'd bought secondhand and hoped no one would notice. At 15, awkward and gangly, standing beside me at his high school graduation. I stopped at a picture from his college graduation. Damon stood between Robert and me, his arm around my shoulders, his face bright with possibility. That was before Robert died, before I learned what I was really made of, before I discovered I had a gift for turning small investments into substantial returns, before I became wealthy and chose to hide it. The phone rang, startling me from my memories. I glanced at the clock. 11:15. Only one person called this late. "Hello, Damon," I answered, knowing his voice before he spoke. "Mom." He sounded strained. "I wanted to apologize for tonight. Brixton feels terrible about the way things went." I almost laughed. Brixton felt terrible. Not sorry, not ashamed. Terrible. As if her cruelty was something that had happened to her, rather than something she'd inflicted on me. "Does she?" I asked mildly. She didn't mean anything by what she said. You know how she gets at these events. The pressure to make everything perfect. "Ah," I said. "So the pressure made her call me an old pauper. I see." Silence stretched between us like a chasm. Finally, Damon sighed. "You heard that." I did. "Mom, you have to understand. This boutique means everything to her. She's been working so hard, and with the economy the way it is, retail is really tough. She's just stressed." I listened to my son make excuses for his wife's cruelty and felt something break inside my chest. When had he become this person? When had he learned to justify the unjustifiable? "Damon," I said quietly, "do you remember when you were 8 and Tommy Morrison called me a poor old bag because my car was older than his mother's?" "Mom, you punched him in the nose. Do you remember that? You came home with a black eye and a note from your teacher, but you were proud. You said nobody was allowed to talk about your mom like that." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. "What happened to that boy?" I asked. "I grew up," he said finally. "I learned that not everything is worth fighting over." "I see. And your mother's dignity isn't worth fighting for? That's not fair, isn't it?" Another long pause. Then, "Look, Mom, Brixton and I have been talking. We think maybe it would be better if you didn't come to these kinds of events anymore. Not because we don't want you there," he added hastily, "but because you seem uncomfortable. And honestly, some of these people, they can be judgmental about appearances." There it was, the real message. Don't come because you embarrass us. "I understand perfectly," I said. "Good. I knew you would. You've always been reasonable." Reasonable. The word my father had used when he expected me to accept less than I deserved. The word Robert had used when he left me alone with a sick baby and mounting debts. The word I'd heard all my life from people who wanted me to shrink myself to fit their convenience. "Yes," I agreed. "I've always been reasonable." After I hung up, I sat in the darkness for a long time. Then I walked to my home office, a small room that had once been Damon's bedroom. The walls were lined with filing cabinets that contained the paper trail of my financial journey, records of every investment, every dividend, every carefully calculated risk that had paid off. I pulled out my laptop and logged into my banking app. The numbers glowed on the screen like a secret weapon. $738,000 in my checking account alone, $2.3 million in various investment portfolios, another $800,000 in real estate holdings that nobody knew I owned. All accumulated over the past 15 years, since Robert's insurance money had given me my first real stake to invest. I had been careful, methodical. I'd started small, buying stocks in companies I understood, researching every investment until my eyes burned. I'd reinvested every penny of profit, living off my Social Security and Robert's pension while my portfolio grew. And I'd told no one. Not my neighbors, who thought I was a sweet old widow getting by on a fixed income. Not my doctor, who still offered me payment plans for routine procedures. Not the ladies at church, who sometimes slipped $20 bills into my purse when they thought I wasn't looking. And certainly not Damon. At first, I'd kept quiet because I wanted to be sure it was real. Money had a way of disappearing as quickly as it came, and I'd learned not to count on anything until it was solid. Then I'd stayed quiet because I wanted to see who my son really was, whether he would visit his mother because he loved her, or because he expected something from her eventually. I'd gotten my answer tonight. My phone buzzed with a text message. Damon again. BTW, Brixton's been having some trouble with the boutique's finances. The rent is higher than expected, and sales are slow. If you happen to know anyone who might be interested in investing. I stared at the message for a long moment. Then I typed back, I'm afraid I don't know any investors. You know how it is with people like me. People like me. Poor people. People who didn't matter. I sent the message and immediately received another one. Right, of course. Just thought I'd ask. Love you. Love you. 3 words that used to mean everything to me. Now they felt like a habit, something he said out of obligation rather than emotion. I closed the laptop and walked to my kitchen, where I'd left the boutique's business card. Luxe Boutique, it read in gold script. Below that, an address I recognized, because I owned the building. Not directly, of course. I wasn't foolish enough to make it obvious. But through a series of LLCs and investment partnerships, I controlled significant real estate in the Meridian district, including the building where my daughter-in-law had just opened her dream boutique, the building where she'd called me an old pauper while standing on property I owned. I thought about the lease agreement that Brixton had signed, the one that included a clause allowing the landlord to terminate with 30 days' notice if the tenant engaged in behavior detrimental to the property's reputation. I thought about the security cameras that recorded everything in the common areas of my buildings. I thought about Damon's text, asking for investors while simultaneously excluding me from their social circle. And I smiled. Over the next few days, I made some calls. Discreet inquiries to people who owed me favors, who could provide information without revealing the source of their interest. What I learned was fascinating. Brixton had maxed out 3 credit cards to fund the boutique's initial inventory. She'd borrowed against Damon's car and taken a second mortgage on their house. The store's operating costs were nearly double what she'd projected, and sales were running at less than 40% of her optimistic forecasts. They were bleeding money. More interesting still, according to my source at the bank, Damon had recently inquired about a loan using his inheritance prospects as collateral. He'd told the loan officer that his mother was elderly and in poor health, and that her modest estate would likely come to him within the next few years. He was counting on my death to solve their financial problems. My son had written me off, literally. That evening, I sat in my recliner with my tea and photo album, but this time I wasn't looking backward. I was planning forward. I thought about the inheritance that Damon was counting on. The one that existed only in his imagination, built on his assumption that his poor mother must have some hidden savings squirreled away. He had no idea that his poor mother owned enough property to make him wealthy beyond his dreams. He had no idea that she had already made very specific plans for that wealth, and he had no idea that those plans no longer included him. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of teaching my son and his wife exactly what it meant to underestimate an old woman. Tonight, I would simply sit in my modest house and remember the boy who once punched a bully for insulting his mother. That boy was gone, but the mother he'd tried to protect was still here, and she was done being reasonable. Monday morning arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of weather that matched my mood perfectly. I stood at my kitchen window, watching the rain streak down the glass while I sipped my coffee and planned my next move. The phone call came at exactly 9:30, just as I'd expected. Mrs. Hayes, this is Jennifer Morrison from Morrison Property Management. I'm calling about the Meridian District building you own through Hartwell Holdings, LLC. I'd been waiting for this call since Friday. Jennifer Morrison was my property manager, a sharp young woman who handled the day-to-day operations of my real estate investments without knowing my true identity. As far as she knew, I was simply the representative for a group of anonymous investors. Good morning, Jennifer. What can I do for you? Or, I wanted to update you on the new tenant in Unit 12A, Luxe Boutique. They've already missed their first quarterly maintenance fee, and frankly, their business practices are concerning our other tenants. I sat down slowly, though I'd expected this news. What kind of concerns? Well, there was an incident at their grand opening on Friday. Several witnesses reported the owner making disparaging comments about customers. Very unprofessional behavior. The type of thing that could affect the building's reputation. I see. What exactly was said? Jennifer cleared her throat uncomfortably. According to multiple witnesses, the owner called an elderly customer an old pauper and suggested she had no business being there. Apparently, this happened in front of a room full of potential clients. I closed my eyes, hearing Brixton's words echo in my memory. Even secondhand, they stung. That is concerning, I agreed. Have there been any other issues? The tenant has been asking other business owners in the building about potential investors. They seem to be having cash flow problems. And honestly, Mrs. Hayes, their lease application was borderline. If we weren't so eager to fill that space. I understand. Please send me a full report, including any witness statements about the incident. Of course. Should I schedule a building inspection? We could cite any violations. Not yet. Let me review everything first. But Jennifer, please keep this conversation confidential. I prefer to handle these matters quietly. Understood. I'll have that report to you by end of business today. After I hung up, I sat in my quiet kitchen and felt the pieces of my plan clicking into place. Brixton had no idea that her casual cruelty had been witnessed by other business owners. She had no idea that those witnesses had reported her behavior to building management. She had no idea that building management reported directly to me. I spent the morning reviewing financial documents that painted an even bleaker picture of Damon and Brixton's situation than I'd imagined. Through my various business connections, I'd learned that they owed nearly $40,000 in credit card debt, had fallen behind on their mortgage payments, and were facing a balloon payment on their business loan in 6 months. The boutique wasn't just struggling, it was failing spectacularly. At noon, I did something I hadn't done in months. I called Damon. Mom, is everything okay? His voice was strained, distracted. I'm fine, dear. I was wondering if you might have time for lunch today. It's been so long since we've had a real conversation. A pause. I could almost hear him calculating whether he had time for his mother's emotional needs. Today's not great. Brixton's having some issues with the store and I'm trying to help her work through them. Financial issues. The silence stretched so long I wondered if the call had dropped. How did you... Never mind. Yes, some cash flow problems. Nothing we can't handle. Of course not, I said gently. You've always been so capable, just like your father. Thanks, Mom. Look, can I call you later? I really need to get back to this. Certainly. But Damon? If there's anything I can do to help. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. Thanks, but unless you've got $50,000 lying around, I think we're on our own with this one. $50,000. The amount they needed to stay afloat. I wish I could help, I said. You know I would if I could. I know, Mom. You've always done your best with what you had. What I had. If only he knew. That afternoon, I drove to the Meridian District. Not to the boutique. I had no intention of subjecting myself to more of Brixton's poison. Instead, I went to Sterling & Associates, the law firm that occupied the building's top floor. Margaret Sterling had been my attorney for the past 5 years, handling all my real estate transactions and estate planning. A woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and kind eyes. She was one of the few people who knew the true extent of my wealth. Marianne, she greeted me warmly, rising from behind her mahogany desk. This is an unexpected pleasure. What can I do for you? I sat down and opened my purse, pulling out the business card from Lux Boutique. I need you to research this business. Quietly. Margaret examined the card, her eyebrows rising slightly. This is in your building on the 4th floor, isn't it? It is. And the owner is my daughter-in-law. Understanding dawned in Margaret's eyes. She'd handled enough family disputes to recognize the signs. What exactly are you looking for? Everything. Their financial situation, their lease terms, their business registration. I want to know every detail of their operation. Marianne, if this is about family issues, it's about business, I said firmly. They're struggling financially, and I need to understand exactly how deep they're in before I make any decisions about their tenancy. Margaret nodded slowly. I'll have a complete report for you by tomorrow afternoon. But may I ask what's prompted this? I thought about Brixton's words, about Damon's casual dismissal of my worth, about the way they'd written me off as a burden to be managed rather than a person to be loved. Let's just say I've learned some uncomfortable truths about my family, I said finally. And I want to make sure I have all the facts before I decide how to proceed. That evening, I sat in my home office going through old letters, notes Damon had written me over the years, birthday cards with generic messages, thank you notes for Christmas gifts. Even his wedding invitation, which had listed me as Mrs. Robert Hayes rather than mother of the groom. I'd told myself then that it was just a space issue, that they'd needed to keep the wording brief. Now I saw it differently. I saw a pattern of gradual erasure, of reducing me to a minor character in my own son's life. The phone rang at 8 o'clock. Damon again. "Mom, I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about wanting to help." My heart jumped. Maybe there was hope. Maybe he'd realized that family mattered more than money. Yes? "Well, you know how you always said that modest house of yours would be worth something someday because of the neighborhood improving?" I knew exactly where this was going, but I let him continue. "Have you ever thought about getting it appraised? I mean, you could probably get a pretty good amount if you sold it, maybe enough to rent a nice apartment in a senior community." "A senior community," I repeated flatly. "Yeah, somewhere with activities and people your age. You'd probably love it. And if the house sold for enough, you could help Brixton and me get back on our feet, like a family investment." There it was, the real reason for his call. "I see. So you want me to sell my home, the home where I raised you, where your father and I lived for 41 years, to fund your wife's failing business. It's not failing. And then move to some institutional setting so you won't have to worry about your poor old mother anymore." "That's not how I meant it. Isn't it?" Silence. "Damon, can I ask you something? When was the last time you visited me because you wanted to see me? Not because you needed something. Not because Brixton thought you should. When did you last come by just because you missed your mother?" The pause was so long I thought he might hang up. "Mom, that's not fair. You know I love you." "Do I? Because lately it feels like you love what you think I can do for you. My house, my imaginary savings, my eventual inheritance. But me? I'm not so sure. You're being dramatic. Am I? Tell me, Damon. What's my favorite color?" "What? My favorite color. If you love me, surely you know something that basic about me." Another silence. "Or my favorite food. Or what I like to do in my spare time. Or the name of my best friend. Tell me anything about who I am that isn't related to what you need from me." "Mom." "You can't, can you?" I heard him take a shaky breath. "This conversation isn't going anywhere productive." "No," I agreed. "I suppose it isn't." After he hung up, I sat in the growing darkness and felt 27 years of motherhood reduce itself to this moment. All the sacrifices, all the love, all the hopes I'd poured into raising him, and this was what I had to show for it. A son who saw me as a financial resource to be managed and eventually liquidated. But he'd made one crucial mistake in his calculations. He'd assumed that his modest mother had nothing more than a modest house and modest savings. He'd never imagined that the woman he dismissed so casually had spent 15 years quietly building an empire. Tomorrow, I would begin showing him exactly how wrong he was. But tonight, I would mourn the son I thought I'd raised. The one who would have protected me from Brixton's cruelty instead of enabling it. The one who would have valued his mother's dignity over his wife's social climbing. That son had never existed. Or perhaps he had once, and I'd simply failed to see when he'd disappeared. Either way, it was time to stop mourning and start acting. I pulled out a fresh legal pad and began making lists. Property holdings to review, investment accounts to restructure, wills to modify. If Damon wanted an inheritance, he would get one. Just not the one he was expecting. Margaret Sterling's report arrived by courier on Wednesday afternoon, bound in a manila folder thick enough to tell a story before I even opened it. I poured myself a cup of coffee and settled into my father's old chair, preparing for what I suspected would be an education in just how deep my son and daughter-in-law had dug themselves. I was not disappointed. Luxe Boutique was hemorrhaging money at a rate that would have been impressive if it weren't so catastrophic. According to Margaret's investigation, Brixton had signed a 5-year lease at $4,000 per month, plus utilities and maintenance fees. Her initial inventory investment had been $68,000, all of it borrowed. Monthly operating expenses, including insurance, utilities, and part-time help, ran another $3,500. To break even, she needed to generate roughly $12,000 in monthly sales. Her actual sales for the first quarter? $2,800. I did the math twice, certain I'd made an error. But the numbers didn't lie. At this rate, the boutique would be bankrupt within 6 months. But the financial picture was only part of the story. Margaret had also included copies of lease violations, complaints from other tenants, and most interesting of all, a recording from the building's security system. I inserted the flash drive into my laptop and watched myself walk into Brixton's boutique, heard the conversations I'd missed while examining merchandise, witnessed the entire evening from angles I hadn't seen. The camera had captured everything. Brixton's dismissive glances at my outfit, her animated conversation with the group of women while I stood nearby, her cruel words about old paupers and depressing clothes. But what struck me most was something I hadn't noticed at the time: Damon's reaction. He'd been within earshot when Brixton made her comments about me. The camera showed him clearly, standing just around a display rack, close enough to hear every word. I watched as his face cycled through emotions: embarrassment, discomfort, and finally, resignation. He'd heard his wife mock his mother, and he'd done nothing. Worse than nothing. He'd actually moved further away, distancing himself physically from the conversation as if to avoid any association with me. I paused the video and stared at my son's face on the screen. This was who he'd become, a man who would let his wife publicly humiliate his mother rather than risk confrontation. My phone rang, interrupting my dark thoughts. The caller ID showed my property manager's number. "Jennifer? What's wrong?" "Mrs. Hayes, I'm sorry to bother you, but we have a situation with the Luxe Boutique tenant. She's demanding to speak with the building owner about what she calls harassment from other tenants." I almost laughed. Harassment? Apparently, several businesses on her floor have complained about her noise levels and inappropriate behavior toward customers. She claims they're just jealous of her success and wants the owner to intervene. I see. And what did you tell her? That I would pass along her concerns. But honestly, Mrs. Hayes, I think we need to consider whether this tenant is worth the trouble. The other businesses are talking about not renewing their leases if something isn't done. The other businesses, the profitable, stable tenants who paid their rent on time and contributed to the building's reputation, versus one failing boutique run by a woman who called elderly customers paupers. "Jennifer, please set up a meeting with Ms. Whitmore Hayes for Friday afternoon. Tell her the building owner will be represented by an agent." Wonderful. Should I arrange for legal counsel to be present? That won't be necessary. I'll handle this personally. After I hung up, I sat back and considered my options. I could end this quickly, serve eviction papers, close the boutique, let Damon and Brixton face their financial ruin without my intervention. But that would be merciful. And mercy was something I was no longer feeling inclined to show. Instead, I wanted to watch. I wanted to see how they handled pressure, how their marriage fared when money became truly tight, how long it took for them to turn on each other when their perfect life started crumbling. I wanted to see who they really were when the masks came off. Thursday evening, I did something I hadn't done since Damon's wedding. I called my sister Patricia in Florida. "Marianne, what a surprise. How are you, honey?" Patricia was 3 years younger than me. A widow like myself who'd moved to Tampa after her husband died. She was the only person who knew even half the truth about my finances. "I'm well, but I need some advice." "About what?" I told her everything. The boutique opening, Brixton's cruelty, Damon's request that I sell my house to fund their failing business, the discovery that they'd been counting on my death to solve their problems. Patricia listened without interruption, making only the occasional sympathetic noise. "So," she said finally, "what are you going to do?" "I don't know. Part of me wants to reveal everything, show them exactly what they've thrown away. But another part wants to let them destroy themselves. Can I tell you what I think? Please. I think you're still hoping Damon will come to his senses. You're waiting for him to defend you, to choose you over that awful woman." I was quiet for a long moment because she was right. "But honey," Patricia continued gently, "he's already made his choice. Multiple times. You can't keep giving him chances to hurt you. So what would you do?" I'd protect myself. You've spent 36 years putting that boy first, sacrificing for him, loving him unconditionally. When did he ever do the same for you? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Never, I whispered. That's right. Never. So stop waiting for him to become the son you deserved and start being the mother you need to be. To yourself. Friday afternoon arrived cold and bright. I dressed carefully for my meeting with Brixton, choosing a simple navy suit and my pearls, the costume of a successful businesswoman rather than an elderly widow. The conference room at Morrison Property Management was sterile and intimidating, all glass and chrome furniture. Jennifer had arranged the meeting for 2 o'clock, giving me time to review the building's policies one more time. Brixton arrived 10 minutes late, dressed in what was obviously her most expensive outfit, a cream-colored designer suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Her blonde hair was perfect, her makeup flawless, but I could see the strain around her eyes. "I'm so sorry I'm late," she said breathlessly, settling into the chair across from Jennifer's desk. Traffic was absolutely horrible. Jennifer made polite noises while I sat quietly in the corner, introduced only as Mrs. Hayes, representing the building ownership group. Brixton barely glanced at me, clearly dismissing me as unimportant. "I'm so grateful you could arrange this meeting," Brixton continued, her voice taking on that syrupy sweetness I'd learned to recognize as her manipulation mode. "I've been having some concerns about the other tenants in the building." "What kind of concerns?" Jennifer asked professionally. "Well, they seem to be spreading rumors about my business, false rumors, and frankly, I think some of them are intimidated by my success." I almost choked on my coffee. Success? The woman was 3 months behind on every bill and hemorrhaging money, but she called it success. "What kind of rumors?" Jennifer pressed. Brixton waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, you know how people talk. Claims about how I treat customers, nonsense about noise complaints. It's all very unprofessional, and frankly, it's affecting my ability to run my business." "I see. And you'd like the building ownership to intervene?" "Exactly. I think these other tenants need to be reminded that we're all supposed to support each other, not tear each other down." Jennifer glanced at me and I gave her a slight nod. "Ms. Whitmore Hayes, I have to ask, have there been any incidents with customers that might have given rise to these concerns?" Brixton's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Nothing significant. You know how it is in retail. Sometimes you have to deal with difficult people who don't understand your target market." "Difficult people?" "Well, yes. People who come in just to look around, touch everything, ask questions when they clearly have no intention of buying anything. It's not good for business to have that kind of customer lingering around." I felt my hands clench in my lap. She was talking about me without knowing it. "I see," Jennifer said carefully. "And how do you typically handle these? Difficult customers?" "I'm always polite, of course, but sometimes you have to be firm. Make it clear that certain people might be more comfortable shopping elsewhere." Jennifer consulted her notes. "Several witnesses have reported hearing you refer to a customer as an old pauper during your opening event." Brixton's face went pale, then flushed red. I would never— "Who said that?" "Multiple witnesses, actually, including other business owners in the building." "Well, they're lying." Brixton's composure cracked, revealing the desperation underneath. "I don't know why they would make something like that up, but it never happened." I cleared my throat softly. "Actually, Ms. Whitmore Hayes, it did happen." She turned to look at me for the first time, really look at me. I watched as confusion flickered across her face, followed by growing recognition. "I was there," I continued calmly. "I heard every word you said about the elderly woman in the faded cardigan, how she should be ashamed of her depressing clothes, how she had no business being at an event like that." Brixton's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "You," she whispered. "I'm the old pauper you were talking about," I said pleasantly, "though I prefer Mrs. Hayes." The silence in the room was deafening. Jennifer was staring between us, clearly trying to piece together the implications. "I don't understand," Brixton stammered. "What are you doing here?" I represent the building ownership group, I said, which was technically true. We take our tenants' behavior very seriously, especially when it affects our reputation and the comfort of other businesses. Brixton looked like she might faint. This has to be some kind of setup. Not a setup, I said gently. Just business. You see, when you mock customers in our buildings, it reflects poorly on all of us. Other tenants have complained. They're concerned about the kind of clientele your behavior might drive away. You can't do this, Brixton said desperately. I have a lease. I have rights. Jennifer consulted her folder. Actually, your lease includes a clause about maintaining the building's professional reputation. Behavior that damages that reputation can be grounds for termination. But Brixton's voice cracked. You don't understand. We've put everything into this business. Everything. I'm sure you have, I said sympathetically. Unfortunately, that doesn't excuse treating customers with disrespect. Brixton stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. I need to call my husband. This isn't over. Of course not, I agreed. You have 30 days to correct the situation. If we receive no further complaints, you can continue your tenancy. 30 days? To demonstrate that you can treat all customers with respect, regardless of their appearance or perceived economic status. Surely that's not too much to ask. Brixton stared at me with something approaching hatred. Then she grabbed her purse and stormed out, her heels clicking angrily on the marble floor. Jennifer and I sat in silence for a moment after the door slammed. Well, Jennifer said finally, that was interesting. Indeed. May I ask how you know her? I smiled, gathering my things. She's my daughter-in-law. Jennifer's eyebrows shot up. Oh my. Oh my indeed. Jennifer, please make sure the security recordings from that night are properly preserved. I have a feeling we might need them. As I drove home, I felt lighter than I had in years. The look on Brixton's face when she realized who I was would sustain me for weeks. But this was just the beginning. Now she would go home to Damon, panicked and desperate. She would tell him what had happened, and he would have to choose between protecting his wife and protecting his relationship with his mother. I was curious to see which he would choose, though I suspected I already knew. The phone started ringing at 6:30 that evening, barely an hour after my meeting with Brixton. I let it ring, then ring again. By the fourth call, I finally answered. Hello, Damon. What the hell did you do? His voice was raw with panic and fury. Brixton came home crying, saying you're trying to destroy her business. She says you're working with the building management to get her evicted. I'm not trying to do anything, I said calmly. I simply attended a routine meeting about tenant behavior. Don't play games with me, Mom. How are you involved with that building? And don't tell me it's a coincidence that you just happened to be in a meeting about Brixton's lease. I sat down slowly, cradling the phone against my ear. This was the moment I'd been working toward, the moment when the careful structure of lies they'd built around my financial situation would finally collapse. You're right, I said. It's not a coincidence. Silence. Then, quietly. What does that mean? It means I have a business interest in that building, Damon. It means when your wife publicly humiliated a customer, me, she was doing it on property that I partly control. That's impossible. You don't have that kind of money, don't I? Another long pause. I could almost hear him trying to reconcile what he thought he knew about his mother with this new information. Mom, what are you talking about? You live in a tiny house. You shop at discount stores. You drive a car that's 15 years old. Because I choose to, I interrupted. Not because I have to. You're lying. The accusation hit me like a slap. Excuse me? You're lying to try to scare us. You're pretending to have money you don't have because you're angry about some stupid comment Brixton made. I felt something cold and final settle in my chest. Even now, even when presented with evidence that contradicted his assumptions, he couldn't accept that he might have misjudged his mother. I see, I said quietly. So in your mind, it's more believable that I would lie about having money than that you simply never bothered to learn the truth about my life. Mom, tell me, Damon, When was the last time you asked me how I was doing financially? When did you last wonder how I managed to keep the house after your father died? How I paid for his funeral? How I've maintained the property for 15 years on Social Security alone? I assumed... You assumed I was struggling because that's what was convenient for you to believe. It made you feel better about visiting me twice a year and calling me once a month. If Mom's just getting by, then surely she doesn't need much attention, right? That's not fair, isn't it? You've been planning to inherit my house, haven't you? Counting on it to solve your financial problems? The silence stretched so long I wondered if he'd hung up. How did you know about that? He finally whispered. Because I'm not the naive old woman you think I am. I know you took out a loan against your inheritance prospects. I know you're drowning in debt. I know you and Brixton have been counting on my death to save you. Jesus, Mom, that's not... We never wanted... What? You never wanted me to die? Just my money? I heard him take a shaky breath. You're twisting everything. Am I? Then explain to me how I'm wrong. Explain how asking me to sell my house to fund your wife's business isn't exactly what I think it is. I thought you'd want to help. That's what family does. Family, I repeated. When Brixton called me an old pauper in front of a room full of strangers, was that what family does? When you stood there and listened to her mock me without saying a word, was that what family does? You don't understand the pressure we're under. No, I cut him off. You don't understand the pressure I've been under. 41 years of marriage to a man who left me alone with bills and a sick baby every time his job called. 15 years of widowhood, learning to manage money and investments while everyone assumed I was helpless. 3 years of watching my son grow more distant and disrespectful, while his wife systematically erased me from his life. Mom, please, I'm tired, Damon. I'm tired of being dismissed, ignored, and taken for granted. I'm tired of being seen as a burden to be managed instead of a person to be loved. But we do love you. No, you love what you think you can get from me. There's a difference. I heard voices in the background, Brixton's shrill tones mixed with Damon's deeper voice. They were arguing, but I couldn't make out the words. Mom, I have to go. Brixton is... She's really upset. Of course she is. Her meal ticket just evaporated. That's cruel. Is it? Or is it just honest? He hung up without saying goodbye. I sat in my quiet kitchen, surrounded by the familiar objects that had witnessed 37 years of my adult life. The tea kettle I'd bought as a newlywed. The scratched table where I'd helped Damon with homework. The window where I'd stood countless mornings, watching him walk to school. All of it suddenly felt like a museum of a life I'd outgrown. The next morning brought a surprise visitor. I was in my garden, deadheading roses, when a black BMW pulled into my driveway. Brixton emerged wearing dark sunglasses despite the overcast sky, her designer dress wrinkled as if she'd slept in it. She walked toward me with the careful steps of someone trying to maintain dignity while everything collapsed around them. "Marianne," she said, stopping at the edge of my flower bed. "We need to talk." I continued pruning, not looking up. "Do we? This has gone far enough. You've made your point." "Have I? And what point is that?" She shifted uncomfortably. "That you're angry about what I said at the boutique. I get it. I was stressed. I said something thoughtless. And you want an apology." I straightened up, meeting her eyes over my roses. "Is that what you think this is about? An apology? I'm here, aren't I? I'm sorry I called you what I called you. It was wrong, and I apologize." And what else? What do you mean, what else? Well, you're here because you want something, Brixton. You always want something when you pretend to be nice to me. So what is it this time? Her mask slipped slightly, revealing the desperation underneath. "I want you to back off. Stop whatever game you're playing with the building management. Let us run our business in peace." "Our business? I thought it was your business. You know what I mean." I set down my pruning shears and faced her fully. "Actually, I don't think I do. See, from where I stand, it looks like you opened a business you couldn't afford, in a building you couldn't afford, selling merchandise to customers you don't respect. That's not... And when that business started failing, as anyone with basic math skills could have predicted, You decided the solution was to convince my son that his mother should sell her home to bail you out. We never asked, didn't you? What was Tuesday night's phone call about then? Damon suggesting I sell my house and move to a senior community so you could have a family investment? Brixton's face went pale. He told you that? He did. Apparently, he thought I'd be thrilled to give up my home of 32 years so you wouldn't have to face the consequences of your poor planning. We're desperate, she said suddenly, her composure cracking. We've lost everything, okay? The house is in foreclosure. The credit cards are maxed out. If the boutique fails, we'll have nothing left. And whose fault is that? It's not about fault, isn't it? You're the one who borrowed $68,000 for inventory. You're the one who signed a lease you couldn't afford. You're the one who treated customers like dirt in front of potential investors. Brixton stared at me, and for the first time since I'd known her, she looked genuinely surprised. How do you know all that? I smiled. Because I'm not the foolish old woman you think I am. But you can't know about the inventory costs or the lease terms unless… She stopped, her eyes widening. Oh my God, you really are involved with the building. Among other things. What other things? I turned back to my roses, letting the silence stretch. Then, tell me, Brixton, what do you know about my late husband's insurance policy? What? Robert died 15 years ago. Did you ever wonder how I managed to keep this house? How I paid for his medical bills, his funeral, the property taxes all these years? You assumed I was barely scraping by. You assumed I was one unexpected expense away from losing everything. You built your whole relationship with me on that assumption. Marianne, I don't understand what you're getting at. I faced her again, and this time I let her see the truth in my eyes. Robert's life insurance policy was worth $300,000. Did you know that? She shook her head mutely. I invested every penny of it. Very carefully, very conservatively at first. Then, as I learned more about the market, more aggressively. Do you know what $300,000 becomes after 15 years of compound growth? No. More than enough to buy the building where your boutique is located. More than enough to fund a dozen businesses like yours without blinking. Brixton stumbled backward as if I'd pushed her. You're lying. Am I? Would you like to see my portfolio statements? My bank records? My property holdings? That's impossible. You live like someone who learned not to waste money on appearances? Like someone who learned that real security comes from planning and discipline, not from designer clothes and overpriced stores? Brixton sat down heavily on my porch steps, her designer dress bunching around her. You let us think you were poor, she whispered. I let you think what you wanted to think. There's a difference. But why? Why would you hide it? I considered the question seriously, because I wanted to see who my son really was, whether he would love me for myself or for what he could get from me, whether the woman he married would treat me with respect regardless of what she thought I could do for her. And now you know. Yes, I said sadly. Now I know. Brixton looked up at me, mascara starting to run down her cheeks. So, what happens now? Are you going to destroy us? Evict us? Make sure we lose everything? I don't need to destroy you, I said gently. You've done that quite well yourselves. Please, she whispered. I know I've been awful. I know I've treated you badly. But please don't take it out on Damon. He loves you. Does he? Or does he love what he thought he could inherit from me? She had no answer for that. Brixton, can I give you some advice? She nodded miserably. Stop blaming other people for your choices. Stop expecting other people to fix your mistakes. And stop treating people badly just because you think they can't hurt you. You never know who's really watching. I gathered my gardening tools and headed for the house, leaving her sitting on my porch steps. At the door, I turned back. Oh, and Brixton, you have 27 days left on that 30-day notice. I'd suggest you use them wisely. Inside my house, I made myself a cup of tea and sat down to update my will. It was time to make some changes. 2 weeks passed in a strange, peaceful quiet. No phone calls from Damon, no surprise visits from Brixton, no desperate pleas or angry demands, just silence, which told me everything I needed to know about their priorities. If they had truly loved me, they would have fought for our relationship. They would have apologized, begged forgiveness, tried to repair the damage. Instead, they were regrouping, strategizing, trying to find another angle to exploit. I wasn't surprised when Margaret Sterling called on a Thursday morning with news. "Marianne, I thought you should know. Your son filed a petition yesterday claiming you're mentally incompetent and requesting guardianship over your affairs." I set down my coffee cup very carefully. "I see. They're claiming you've been making irrational financial decisions and that your judgment has been compromised. They want control of your assets to protect you from yourself." The audacity of it was breathtaking. When manipulation failed, when pleading failed, they'd decided to simply take what they wanted through legal means. What evidence are they presenting? It's all circumstantial. Claims that you've been acting paranoid, making accusations against family members, isolating yourself from loved ones. They're painting a picture of an elderly woman in decline. I laughed, surprising myself with the sound. How fascinating! And when is this hearing scheduled? Next Tuesday at 10 a.m. Marianne, you need to take this seriously. These kinds of petitions can be very persuasive to judges, especially when they involve elderly people and concerned family members. Oh, I'm taking it very seriously indeed. In fact, I think it's time to end this charade once and for all. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in 15 years. I called my financial advisor at Goldman Sachs. "Mrs. Hayes, what a pleasure to hear from you. How can we help you today?" "Jonathan, I need you to prepare a complete portfolio summary. Every account, every investment, every property holding. I want it detailed, notarized, and ready for court presentation." "Court? Is there a problem?" "You could say that. My family is attempting to have me declared incompetent so they can gain control of my assets." "Good Lord. Do they have any idea about your actual financial situation?" "None whatsoever, and I think it's time they learned. I'll have everything ready by Monday morning, Mrs. Hayes. If you don't mind me saying, this is going to be quite a shock for them." "Jonathan, that's exactly what I'm counting on." Saturday brought another surprise. Patricia called from Florida, her voice tight with worry. "Marianne, honey, I just got a very strange phone call from your son." "Did you now? What did he want?" "He was asking me questions about you. Whether I'd noticed any changes in your behavior lately. Whether you'd seemed confused or paranoid when we talked. He said he was concerned about your mental state." I closed my eyes. "And what did you tell him?" "I told him he was out of his mind. I told him you're the sharpest 71-year-old woman I know, and if he's concerned about your mental state, maybe he should try actually talking to you instead of interrogating your relatives." "Good girl. But Marianne, what's this really about?" "He mentioned something about you making wild claims about having money, accusing his wife of things. Patricia, what would you say if I told you my investment portfolio is worth over $3 million? Silence. "Then, I'd say that explains a lot about why you never seemed worried about retirement. You wouldn't think I was having delusions of grandeur?" "Honey, you've been making smart financial decisions since you were 25 years old. If anyone could turn Bob's insurance money into millions, it would be you." This was why Patricia was my only real family. She knew me. She believed in me. She didn't need proof or explanations to accept that I was capable of success. "So what are you going to do about Tuesday?" she asked. "I'm going to give them exactly what they're asking for," I said. The truth. Tuesday morning dawned crisp and clear. I dressed with particular care, choosing a navy blue suit I'd bought but never worn, pearls that had belonged to my mother, and shoes that whispered money rather than shouting it. I arrived at the courthouse early and found Damon and Brixton huddled with their attorney near the entrance. Damon looked terrible, his face gaunt, his expensive suit hanging loose as if he'd lost weight. Brixton was perfectly groomed as always, but I could see the strain around her eyes. They noticed me approaching, and their attorney stepped forward, clearly expecting some kind of desperate negotiation. "Mrs. Hayes, I'm David Morrison, representing your son. I wonder if we might speak privately before the hearing." "I'm afraid I don't see the point, Mr. Morrison. We'll all be speaking quite publicly in a few minutes. Mrs. Hayes, I want you to understand that no one is questioning your worth as a person. This is simply about ensuring your financial security as you age. Mr. Morrison, I interrupted gently, has anyone explained to you exactly what financial assets you're seeking to protect? He looked confused. I'm sorry? My son petitioned the court claiming I'm making irrational financial decisions. I assume you've reviewed my financial situation to determine what needs protecting? Well, we know about your house, of course, and your Social Security, your late husband's pension. I see. And those are the only assets you're aware of? Are there others? Instead of answering, I handed him a thick folder. Perhaps you should review this before we go inside. David Morrison opened the folder and his face went completely white. Behind him, I heard Damon ask, "What is it? What's in there?" The attorney flipped through pages, his expression growing more stunned with each document. Finally, he looked up at me with something approaching awe. "Mrs. Hayes, this shows assets totaling over $3.7 million. $3.7 million, Damon repeated faintly. That can't be right. Real estate holdings worth $1.2 million. Investment portfolio worth $2.3 million. Liquid assets of $200,000. The attorney continued reading. Mrs. Hayes, why didn't you mention this when your son first expressed concerns about your financial management? He never asked, I said simply. He simply assumed I was incompetent because I'm elderly and live modestly. Brixton stepped forward, her face flushed. This has to be fake. She's created false documents to avoid the guardianship. I smiled and handed her another folder. Those are all notarized statements from Goldman Sachs, my property management company, and my bank. Feel free to call and verify. The courtroom was mostly empty when we were called before Judge Harrison, a stern-looking woman in her 60s who clearly had little patience for family drama. Mr. Morrison, you've petitioned this court to appoint a guardian for Mrs. Mary Ann Hayes, claiming she's mentally incompetent to manage her financial affairs. Present your evidence. David Morrison stood slowly, clearly rattled by his last-minute discovery. Your Honor, I need to request a brief recess to review some new information that's come to light. Denied. Present your case or withdraw the petition. Morrison looked helplessly at Damon, who was staring at me as if I'd grown a second head. Your Honor, we withdraw the petition. On what grounds? On the grounds that the petitioner was misinformed about the respondent's financial situation and mental capacity. Judge Harrison raised an eyebrow and looked at me. Mrs. Hayes, do you have anything to say about this matter? I stood up slowly. Your Honor, I'd like to address my son's concerns about my mental capacity. Proceed. My son believes I'm incompetent because I discovered that his wife publicly humiliated me, calling me an old pauper at her business's grand opening. When I took steps to address this behavior through proper channels, he concluded I must be delusional. What kind of steps? I'm part of the investment group that owns the building where her business is located. When other tenants complained about her unprofessional behavior, I attended a meeting to address their concerns. Judge Harrison looked at the financial documents that had been submitted as evidence. Mrs. Hayes, these documents show substantial assets. Were you hiding these from your family? I wasn't hiding anything, Your Honor. I was simply living according to my values rather than my means. My son assumed I was poor because I chose not to be ostentatious with my wealth. And why did you make that choice? I looked directly at Damon as I answered. Because I wanted to know if my family loved me for who I am, or for what they thought they could get from me. The judge followed my gaze. And what did you learn? That they loved what they thought they could inherit from me. When they discovered I was financially secure, they didn't celebrate my success. They tried to take control of my assets. Judge Harrison was quiet for a long moment. Then she leaned forward. Mr. Hayes, is your mother's assessment accurate? Damon stood shakily. Your Honor, we never meant to. We thought she needed help. Did you ask her if she needed help? Not exactly. Did you ask her about her financial situation? No, Your Honor. Did you try to have any substantive conversation with her about your concerns before filing this petition? Damon's silence was answer enough. Judge Harrison shook her head. This petition is denied. Mrs. Hayes, you appear to be entirely competent to manage your own affairs. In fact, you appear to have managed them quite successfully for many years without your family's interference. She fixed Damon with a stern look. Mr. Hayes, Attempting to gain guardianship over a competent adult's assets is a serious matter. If your mother chose to pursue charges for attempted fraud, she would likely have grounds. Your Honor, I interjected, I don't wish to pursue charges. I simply want my family to understand that I'm perfectly capable of making my own decisions about my life and my money. And what decisions have you made? I took a deep breath. This was the moment I'd been building toward for weeks. I've decided to revise my will, Your Honor. My son and his wife will inherit nothing from me. Instead, my assets will go to organizations that support elderly people who are actually in need, and to individuals who have shown me genuine kindness over the years. The courtroom was completely silent. I could hear Brixton's sharp intake of breath, saw Damon's face crumple. Mrs. Hayes, the judge said gently, that's entirely your right. Thank you, Your Honor. I just wanted to make sure my son understood that actions have consequences. After the hearing, I walked out of the courthouse alone. Damon and Brixton huddled near their car, deep in what looked like a heated argument. I could see the exact moment their marriage began to fracture under the pressure of their ruined plans. I didn't feel sorry for them. My phone rang as I reached my car. Patricia. Well? How did it go? It went perfectly. I'm finally free. Free from what, honey? From the obligation to pretend I don't see who they really are. From the hope that they might change. From the guilt about protecting myself from people who never protected me. I drove home through streets that looked brighter somehow, past landmarks that no longer held painful memories, but simply marked the geography of a life well lived. My house sat at the end of Maple Street exactly as it had for 32 years, but now it felt like a sanctuary rather than a hiding place. Inside, I made myself a cup of tea and sat down to call my attorney. There were documents to finalize, charities to contact, a new life to begin. At 71 years old, I had finally learned the most important lesson of all. You don't owe anyone your suffering just because they share your DNA. Outside my kitchen window, the roses I'd been tending that morning when Brixton came to plead with me were blooming magnificently. They had required careful cultivation, patience, and the wisdom to prune away the parts that were diseased or dead. Not unlike my life, 3 months later, I received a card in the mail. It was from Eleanor Hartwell, the kind woman I'd met at the boutique opening, the one who'd also felt out of place among the shallow glamour. Dear Marianne, she'd written, I hope you don't mind me reaching out. I got your address from the church directory. I wanted to thank you for that lovely conversation at the boutique opening. You were the only genuine person I met that evening. I was wondering if you'd like to join me for tea sometime. I smiled and reached for my phone. It was time to make some new friends. Real ones this time. The old Marianne had spent decades believing that family was everything, that blood ties were sacred, that love meant endless sacrifice and forgiveness. The new Marianne understood that family wasn't about genetics. It was about respect, kindness, and genuine care. And sometimes the family you choose is infinitely more valuable than the one you were born into. I had chosen well. And finally, blessedly, I was free. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.